Live from our nation's capital, it's Deadline DC with Brad Bannon.
Welcome to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. I'm Brad Bannon, the host of Deadline DC. I'm a national Democratic strategist, a columnist for the Messenger in Washington, D.C., and a political analyst for news radio station KNX in Los Angeles. You can read my columns in the Messenger at muckrack.com, that's M-U-C-K-R-A-C-K, muckrack.com/Brad Bannon /articles. My company, Bannon Communications, research polls for progressive issue groups, labor unions, and Democrats. Mondays on Deadline DC, I talk to the people and players behind the politics and policies that drive our great nation forward. Our intrepid executive producer, Mark Grimaldi, is on the boards to make sure the show runs smoothly and to try to get me securely through the rough patches, of which there are many some days. Today on Deadline DC with Brad Bannon, we're going to talk about the two big E's in the news. First, Bob Deans, Director of Strategic Engagement at the Natural Resources Defense Council, talks about the fires in Maui and other environmental disasters. Then in the second half hour, noted economist Dr. Rob Shapiro joins me for a status update on the state of the economy. But before we bring on our first guest, we have this clip from MSNBC where we have the governor of Hawaii, Dr. Josh Green, discussing the disastrous impact of climate change on wildfires in Maui.
My reaction, of course, as an emergency room doctor, more than as a governor, is that it is almost impossible to know in the throes of the acute part of a crisis if you did everything that you could. We have, in my office, asked for a comprehensive review with our attorney general because we decided to be on this fully transparently right from the start. But let me share a few things. What was happening was this. It was a fire hurricane. And I want to warn the entire planet about this, all of America and all of the world. We were experiencing very dry conditions, drought conditions because of global warming, which is obviously very real for us here and everywhere. In addition to those drought conditions and difficulties with water management because there's just not enough water here in our islands, we then had the penumbra of a hurricane. Hurricane Dora had just passed south of us, leaving 60-mile-per-hour winds still with gusts up to 81 miles per hour. So what happened was when fire jumped from one spot to another, there were 3 or 4 fires going on at the same time. It got seeded very quickly with those 80-mile-per-hour gusted winds. And then the fire moved essentially at a mile per minute, 60 miles an hour down through the community. And that's what a fire hurricane is going to look in the era of global warming. And so we have to all do right now what we can to stop global warming and reverse it. Now, as to the sirens, we'll know soon whether or not they did enough to get those sirens going. But there was massive destruction of telecommunications. Otherwise, we ourselves would have communicated with each other like we always do within seconds on our cell phones. And that's basically what happened. But we'll make sure we get to all the answers that people deserve. I've also authorized the dual status command center with the president and the Joint Chiefs. So now we have a lot of military presence to protect the area also, right, and let people do the investigation.
That was Hawaii Governor Dr. Josh Green, who's also an emergency room physician, talking about the devastating fires in Hawaii and Maui over the weekend. Our guest in this half hour is Bob Deans, Director of Strategic Engagement for the Natural Resources Defense Council. The The National Resources Defense Council combines the power of more than 3 million members and online activists with the expertise of some 700 scientists, lawyers, and policy advocates across the globe to ensure the rights of all people to the air, water, and wild. The website for NRDC is nrdc.org, and their Twitter handle is also NRDC. Bob's also the author of 2012 book Reckless, The Political Assault on the American Environment, which I'm sure you can find online at Amazon or one of those sites. Bob, welcome back to Deadline DC.
Thanks, Brad. Great to be with you.
Let's start with the wildfires in Maui, and as a way of introducing the topic of the disastrous consequences of climate change.
Sure. I mean, I think first, and I know I echo your thoughts here, our hearts go out to the people of Lahaina, the people of Maui, the people all across the great state of Hawaii. This has just been a devastating tragedy, the deadliest wildfire in our country in well over a century, Brad. And so if people who are listening want to chip in somehow, there's a organization called Maui Strong you can look up, and they're getting real relief right on the ground to people just beginning what's going to be a long and difficult recovery process there in Maui. This, unfortunately, is the face of climate change. Many factors involved. Nobody is claiming that climate change is the reason for what happened. But there is no doubt that Hawaii has been experiencing warmer, drier weather in recent decades. We know that warmer, drier weather creates the conditions for making wildfires, when they occur, more devastating, more difficult to put out, and just very much more lethal. So in this case, we don't yet know what started the fire. 99% of the fires in Hawaii wildfires in Hawaii are started from man-made causes, as similar to much of the rest of the country. But whatever caused it, you have a situation where in Hawaii, since 1950, average temperatures have increased by 2 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a lot. It's a little bit faster than global warming has happened more broadly. We also know that just since 1990, Hawaii is getting 31% less rain during that critical rainy winter. And also in this year particularly, about a little more than a third of Maui is experiencing actual drought, Brad, to where they're getting a little more than half as much rain in June and July as they normally would in what is already a dry season. And this is what happens. You get thinner cloud cover. The canopy from forests, from trees, thins out. As a result of that, the soil gets drier, and then the vegetation gets drier. And particularly these grasses outside of Lahaina were fuel just waiting to virtually explode when this wildfire, this fire hurricane, as the governor called it, came ripping through at speeds of moving more than 60 miles per hour. It overwhelmed the community. It overwhelmed individuals' capacity to, in many tragic cases, even escape with their lives. Some people who did escape were forced to flee into the Pacific Ocean. This is a horrific tragedy. And what we're learning about it are 3 things. Number one, this is a global climate crisis. The impacts are global. Every single community is at risk. Number 2, these disasters are happening at a pace and at a scale that is beginning to overwhelm our capacity to cope with them at a local and in sometimes even national governmental level. And number 3, we have got to accelerate all efforts to both reduce the amount of fossil fuels we're burning that are driving this crisis, adapt to the disasters that are already baked into the system, and help our communities to deal with the recovery, the loss, the damage from this kind of devastation, Brad.
Okay. We're going to go take a short break, at least for our radio listeners. We're going to stay on line with our guest, Bob Deans from the Natural Resources Defense Council, and we'll bring in our radio listeners in a few minutes, back in a few minutes. Until then, we are now doing Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is Bob Deans from the Natural Resources Defense Council.
If you came across someone struggling with hunger, how would you recognize them? By their...
Okay. Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is Bob Deans, Director of Strategic Engagement for the Natural Resources Defense Council. Bob's written a book on that I'm sure you can find on Amazon, The Political Assault on the American Environment. Bob wrote this in 2012, but 11 years later, it's still important reading. So I definitely advise you to get hold of a copy if you can and read it. I hope someday to get my copy autographed by Bob. Okay. Let's, Bob, we were talking about the heat, long periods of drought in Hawaii. It reminded me, I think we had you on the air last year sometime talking about the droughts in California, which caused fires, and then they were followed by, I think over the last winter, by flooding. So it's, a very common pattern, especially in the Western United States. We all sorts of other weather disasters in the Eastern United States. We had firefighters, fires up in Canada last month that were shrouding cities in the Northeast in smog. We have, all sorts of hurricanes, tornadoes in the Mid-South. So we have plenty of weather disasters. But let's go back to the heat. In July, I believe, we recorded the highest level of heat ever recorded in the world in July. And I believe we either reached the 1.6 Celsius mark or came damn close to it. Explain what the 1 Celsius mark is.
Sure, Mark. Yeah, these are 1.5 degrees Celsius is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And right now, over the past century or so, the average global temperature has increased about 1.1 degrees Celsius. And what you hear scientists say was reflected in the landmark Paris Climate Accord of 2015, which was a global goal to limit average global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is the point at which we reach a sort of tipping point. And what we're seeing now in terms of bad outcomes from the climate crisis become actually catastrophic. And they begin to get completely out of hand to the point where a widening part of the globe is no longer habitable for human beings. And so we want to hold warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius globally. What happened in July? July was the hottest month on record. These are records going back to 1880. So more than 140 years of global temperature record keeping. And July was the hottest month we've had in that time. And it was 1.5 degrees Celsius above the norm, above where we were a century ago.
Okay, so we're going to, Bob, I'm going to have to interrupt you because we're going to bring back our radio listeners. We will have more with Bob Deans of the Natural Resources Defense Council right after this break. Welcome back to Deadline DC. Brad Mann. Our guest in this half hour is Bob Deans, who is Director of Strategic Engagement for the Natural Resources Defense Council. We've been talking about the heat that has enveloped the world this summer. We're very all too close to deadly heat limits. And I want to remind our radio listeners that if you want to watch us as well as listen to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon, you can watch us, or at least a couple of ways you can watch us. You can watch us live or the podcast anytime at twitter.com/Brad Bannon, or you can watch on facebook.com/Deadline DC with Brad Bannon /videos. Now back to our guest, Bob Deans from the Natural Resources Defense Council. Bob, in the previous segment, we were talking about the record heat that's, afflicted the whole world, the southern United States, Europe, Asia, Africa. And I read something that I think was posted on the NRDC website that already this summer, 147 people have died in Arizona, directly attributable to the heat.
It's astounding and tragic. Arizona, Texas, Florida, we've had people working on the job trying to make a living and dying from this oppressive heat. It of course, can cause heat strokes, can cause heart attacks. It can exacerbate existing respiratory ailments, and it's particularly dangerous for older folks, children, and people who have to work outside for a living, agricultural workers, construction workers, road workers, and others. And so one thing we've seen this summer is President Biden accelerating efforts to get a rule in place nationally by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to protect workers from this kind of heat. Also, we're seeing moves in Congress for some legislation to provide assistance. This assistance is long overdue. What Congress is looking to do is to do a better job of coordinating among federal agencies and coordinate a national system of heat advisory. Number two, to provide more focused research on the dangers of working in extreme heat. And number three, to provide resources for communities and worker organizations to help them cope with the consequences of this kind of extreme heat. We're going to need more of this, Brad, not less, as temperatures continue to rise.
I seem to remember recently reading that the state government in Texas had pulled back on warnings for people working outside in the state during the summer. And, it makes me wonder sometimes. That gets to a bigger question. And my bigger question is, every night when I watch the network news, they pretty much start off with the weather disaster pretty much every night this summer, unless former President Trump gets indicted again, and that usually leads. But if he doesn't get indicted that day, it's usually a weather disaster that leads off. And I saw an article that the president of NRDC, Manish Buchner, wrote, and he says this is time for resolve, not depression, about what's going on. And the problem is I get depressed every night when I'm watching the network news and they talk about fires in Maui, or flooding somewhere else, or tornadoes in the Mid-South, or, smog from Canadian fires shrouding DC and New York. Is there enough resolve in the nation to do something about this? Because every night when I see these news stories, I think, are people just going to let this go on? Is anybody learning a lesson from this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think where Manish really wanted to weigh in on this, because as the father of two children, he has to answer some tough questions at home from them. And one of the things that he feels very strongly about is that despair is not while it may be a natural response to the overwhelming train of climate disasters confronting us right now, it is not the constructive way forward. And we can't sink into despair. That's closely akin to surrender, and that is something he will not do. And where he draws his resolve is thinking that we absolutely must confront this crisis every way we know how. And there is a scientific path forward. In other words, the science tells us we can hold warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is a horrific amount of warming, but it is a manageable amount of warming. We can do it. Number two, economics. This is the economic play of our lifetime. Globally, this year, Brad, investors will put up $1.7 trillion to help us become more efficient so we do more with less waste, to help us get more clean power from the wind and the sun, to help us build electric vehicles and advanced batteries. That's important. And finally, real momentum. We're actually changing, we're actually shifting, and we're shifting faster than anyone believed. Right here in this country, Brad, Wednesday, the 16th, will mark 1 year since President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act. In that year alone, we've invested more than $84 billion to build domestic factories that are going to make solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, advanced batteries, and the like. More than $84 billion, creating more than 74,000 good paying jobs in places like Ohio, Georgia, Michigan, South Carolina, Kansas, all across the country. And so this kind of momentum is something to build on. And here's what we know. When you combine this kind of investment in clean energy with the rules that the Biden administration is putting in place to clean up our cars, trucks, and dirty power plants, we have positioned the country, we're on track to cut the carbon pollution and other greenhouse gases driving the climate crisis by 45% by 2030, 45% reduction by 2030 compared to the 2005 levels. That's within striking distance of the goal the president said of 50 to 52% reductions by that time. We can get there, Brad. We need to keep moving forward and build on the progress we're making.
Okay, we only have about 30 seconds left. I'm going to ask you, today there was a court ruling in Montana that said that essentially Montanans have a constitutional right to a clean environment. Your thoughts quickly?
Well, very quickly, we'll wait to see the legal implications of this. That will be shaking out, but this is very important ruling. And what it is saying is a constitutional right to the next generation to inherit a livable world. That's what we got from our forefathers. That's what we got from our ancestors. That's what we must deliver to our children. And what we've been talking about right now is the way to do it. A very important decision. The court's on the right side of history. We look forward to seeing how it plays out.
Bob, thank you very much for joining us today. Our guest was Bob Deans, Director of Strategic Engagement at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Our guest in the next segment will be noted economist Dr. Robert Shapiro.
The Alzheimer's Association and the Ad Council present the story of Tom
Thank you,
and
Bob.
Levi.
Tom is the smartest man
Always
I
a
know.
pleasure.
He's been a professor at 2 major universities, been a teacher for over 40 years. One day, he told me that he was having problems in his classes. I think one of the students had asked the question and he didn't remember the answer. And I also noticed that he was letting his class out earlier than they were supposed to let out. And he was telling them that he was doing it as a favor to them, but I think in reality, he just wanted to get out of there. I was really starting to worry because I saw something was wrong.
Levi and I talked about how it would change our lives, but he was there beside me, and my love for him was just immense.
When something feels different, it could be Alzheimer's. Now is the time to talk. Visit alz.org/ourstories to learn more. A message from the Alzheimer's Association and the Ad Council.
What grows in the forest? Trees? Sure. Know what else grows in the forest? Our imagination, our sense of wonder, and our family bonds grow too. Because when we disconnect from this and connect with this, we reconnect with each other. and build family memories we will carry with us forever. The forest is closer than you think. Find a forest near you and start exploring at discovertheforest.org. It's easy. Just put in your zip code to find family-friendly outdoor destinations near you. You'll also find guides to free activities, games, and amazing forest facts. Give the magic of the outdoors to your kids and reconnect with your family. Find a forest near you at discovertheforest.org. That's discovertheforest.org. Brought to you by the United States Forest Service and the Ad Council.
Ohio voters scored a big election victory for women's rights last week. It was a tricky vote, too, deceptively couched as a statewide referendum to approve a little technical change in the procedure for approving statewide referendums. How boring. But Ohioans figured out that it really was a big vote on an underhanded ploy by right-wing Republicans to block the right of women to make their own reproductive decisions. Not boring. So, in a huge turnout, a whopping 57% of voters said yes to women and no to the tricksters. Yet the referendum actually did encompass a procedural issue that's an even bigger political story than the election results, namely, the GOP's ongoing attempts to rig election rules so its extremist minority can, quote, win without getting a majority of the votes. Background. A state constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to abortion is already set to be voted on this November in Ohio. Right-wing Republican leaders, though, fear that more than half of Ohioans will support that amendment. Thus, last week's referendum was their desperate attempt to win by losing, specifically by decreeing that, hocus pocus, constitutional initiatives must get 60% approval to become law. Yes, a 40% minority of voters could nullify the majority will of the people. This is Jim Hightower saying this gaming of the system by devious Republican officials and far-right extremists has become their core political strategy across the country. It's actually a deeply embarrassing admission by them. They are conceding that they are now captives of ideological extremism and outright nutballism, making their party so completely out of touch with the American majority that they can't win honestly. So they've become the anti-democracy party, acting as rabid political veterinarians out to fix democracy by neutering the power of the people.
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Today in the second half hour, we're going to talk about the economy after talking about the other big E in the first half hour, the environment. We're going to start off with this clip from Jim Tankersley, covers economics to the New York Times, talking about improvements in the economy.
We're seeing a bunch of things that are encouraging. The first is on growth. The economy keeps growing and adding jobs faster than economists predicted. So in the second quarter this year, the economy expanded at a 2.4% annual rate. That was way better than most economists thought it would be. At the same time, the job market just continues to churn on. Month after month, we are seeing hundreds of thousands of jobs being added to the economy, despite the fact that forecasters keep waiting for that to slow down, despite the fact that President Biden himself has been waiting for that to slow down. It is slowing down, but very gradually, and that growth, the combination of job growth and economic growth, is really powering the economy forward. At the same time, and I think this is the most encouraging thing to people who are out shopping right now, or if you're the president, to his advisors, is the fact that inflation is coming down. A year ago, we had like 7% annual inflation by one measure, and now it's 3%. This is way better than I think a lot of economists thought we could pull off with those continued growth rates that I mentioned. And one more really important thing, really great sign for the economy, is that people's standard of living is starting to improve in a way that it hadn't at the first couple of years of the Biden presidency. Hourly wages rose faster than prices did in the spring for the first time in 2 years, which just means people have more money to spend. Their incomes are actually going up, even in inflation-adjusted terms. That's really good news, and that's the sort of thing that the president's team has been looking for a long time.
That was Jim Tankersley from the New York Times talking about the improvements in the economy since Joe Biden's been president. The economy is back, and it's well past time for the president to start spreading the news about the Biden boom. Since the president inherited the crumbling economy, that his predecessor left behind. He has recovered the 10 million jobs that disappeared under Trump and added more than 3 million more. The president's deft handling of the economic recovery is based on his ability to convince the closely divided Congress to pass a significant laws such as the American Recovery Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Chips Act that contributed to the economic boom. By the way, tomorrow is the first anniversary of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. The president and his administration tried to tout his economic success story before the midterm elections last year, but the initiative failed and to move his economic approval rating. The administration has just launched a new campaign to sell its economic successes to the public. It is a propitious time to try again. Legislative successes in 2021 and 2022 have flowered into impact on the financial health and well-being of working families. When the president reminded Americans of the recovery last year, job growth was high, but runaway inflation made it difficult to make the sale. Now the audience will be more receptive after 30 straight months of job growth and a sharp decline in the inflation rate. By the way, that's from one of my columns in the Messenger. If you'd like to read all my columns in the Messenger, you can read them at muckrack.com/Brad Bannon /articles. Our guest in this half hour is our own economic policy resource, Dr. Robert Shapiro, chairman of Sonecon, an economic advisory firm and a senior fellow at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. He is an internationally known economist who has advised several prominent Democrats on economic policy. He was Undersecretary of Commerce for Economic Affairs in the Clinton administration. Dr. Shapiro's Twitter handle is Rob Shapiro. Welcome back to Deadline DC, Dr. Shapiro. Always a pleasure to have you.
Always a pleasure to be here, Brad.
Okay, well, let's start with this. You heard the clip from Jim Tankersley from the New York Times. Talks about the growing job growth and the decline of the inflation rate. So my question to you is, what is the status of the economy right now?
Well, the status of the economy, I'd say, is sound. It's particularly sound because we've come through a period of really almost unprecedented shocks to the economy. We closed the entire economy down for about a month in 2020. We lost over 10 million jobs in a very short period of time. Actually, we lost 18 million jobs in a short time and then recovered some of them fairly quickly. And then, as you said, the last 10 million were recovered under President Biden. And then we had an inflationary shock. This came primarily from problems in supply chains that were caused by the pandemic, which after all was happening everywhere in the world. It was closing down ports, closing down production. It also came from OPEC policy, which decided to raise energy prices. Which was then compounded by Putin's war. And because Ukraine is a major exporter of natural gas. And so you had these shocks, and then you also had the large stimulus from the administration, which was necessary because so many Americans were frightened by the pandemic and the prospects and uncertain about what the next stage would be, that they started saving at much higher rates. So we needed to push more money into the economy to offset that sharp drop in spending from higher savings. It turns out that inflation is down because the bottlenecks have been resolved. The energy prices have eased down, not because OPEC changed or Putin changed, but because China is in its first modern recession. And China is an enormous source of demand for energy. It produces it has no oil and no natural gas. Got a lot of coal, but that's not enough. So the inflation is coming down. It's not gone because there is still a lot of demand in the economy, and that comes from every month bringing hundreds of thousands of new people on jobs getting paychecks. And because paychecks have been rising, in particular in the bottom half of the labor force. And those are people who spend virtually everything they earn, as opposed to high income people who save some. And that means that, demand has been rising relatively quickly. So you get some inflation, but the direction of inflation has been correct and encouraging. And I have to say something I predicted a year ago.
Okay, well, that's good. That's why we have you on the show, is because your ability to see into the future. Let me ask you this question. First of all, earlier in the year, there were a lot of economists who thought we were going to hit a recession before the presidential election last year. Is the danger of a recession before the election, which would be a real problem for the Biden administration and his reelection campaign, what is the likelihood of a recession after, so much growth?
The likelihood of a recession, unless the Federal Reserve comes back with several more interest rate increases. You cannot have a recession when you have a fast expanding labor market. And we continue to see this. And so I think the likelihood of a recession this year, which a lot of economists were predicting, is virtually zero. If inflation were to heat up again for reasons that we can't predict right now, for some outside event, the Federal Reserve would put in place 2 or maybe 3 more interest rate hikes, and that could bring us close to a recession next year.
I'm going to have to stop. Okay, I'm going to have to stop you there. We're going to take a short break for our radio listeners, but Dr. Shapiro and I are going to keep going. Our video audience on Twitter and Facebook is going to keep going, but we're going to give a short 4-minute break to our radio listeners. But we'll come back to you. Don't despair.
There are a ton of social networking websites, but one stands apart for a very special reason. This one saves lives. It's matchingdonors.com. Matchingdonors.com.
Okay. Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is Dr. Robert Shapiro, the noted economist, who is also the chairman of Sonecon, an economic advisory firm. Let me ask you about this, Rob. Seems to me that the Biden administration is taking another shot at selling its economic successes. Mm-hmm. Now, pretty much every time I've had you on in the past, I've asked you the same question, is if the economy is so good, why aren't people noticing it? Joe Biden's approval rating on handling the economy is still at about, 40% 40, you know, in the high 30s usually. But they've started a new effort centered around the motto or tagline, Bidenomics. First of all, do you think this initiative by the Biden administration to sell its economic successes is going to work this time? And it better have, because it's getting closer and closer to the presidential election.
Yes, I do think it'll work. It'll work because the underlying reality is good. People, the polling on approving of his handling of the economy, you have to take that with a grain of salt. In this era, everyone who opposes the president will say unfavorable, no matter what their economic conditions are. So you're starting out, down a huge amount. And, we can look at, instead of looking at polls, we can look at what happened in the 2022 election, which was the Democrats picked up a seat in the House, picked up governorships, picked up state legislatures, and did much better in the House than was expected. Well, that doesn't happen if the party in power has a bad economy. The fact is, voters are voting their own conditions, and so I'm not concerned. I urge the administration to make the case for their economic successes, particularly the labor market and GDP growth, which are much, much better than anything Trump ever did in his first 2 years. I made that case to them for the last 18 months. And
maybe they heard you finally.
Well, I think they finally did. And part of the argument that I made and others made was that is all the public hears is all the negative news coming out of the Republicans. And when they're silent, people assume that's correct, and that the way to—
Bob, I'm going to have to interrupt you again. We're coming out of a break for our radio listeners. We'll be right back with more from our guest, the noted economist, Dr. Robert Shapiro.
I seem to be—
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is Dr. Robert Shapiro, the noted economist and the chairman of an economic advisory firm, Sonicon. By the way, note to our radio listeners, if you'd like to see us as well as listen to us, you can do that on twitter.com/Brad Bannon or on facebook.com/Deadline DC with Brad Bannon /videos. This as well as hear us, and you don't have to anyway, but that's what I would do if I was a radio listener. Anyway, our guest is Dr. Robert Shapiro, noted economist and chairman of the economic advisory firm Sonicon. Let me ask you about this, Rob. You recently wrote an article about Ron DeSantis and his so-called economic policy. And, I'd like you to talk about it, but when I read your article, I thought to myself, gee, did they throw that together without checking the Biden economic stats? Anyway, go ahead, and why don't you talk about your article about Ron DeSantis?
Well, the remarkable thing about the DeSantis so-called economic declaration was that everything he cited as his goals were things that the Biden administration has already achieved. He said he wanted to have 3% annual growth. Well, in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, real GDP has grown at an average of 4%. That's more than 50% greater than the average in Trump's first 2 years. He wanted a fair labor market by securing the border. Well, as you've mentioned, we've had historic employment gains. And as to the border and its putative impact on jobs, Biden, in fact, has been more aggressive than Trump was. The annual enforcement actions at the border averaged almost 1.2 million cases a year in 2021 and 2022, as opposed to Trump, who averaged 750,000 in 2017 and 2018. And finally, the Republicans always say we need to unleash American energy independence. Well, that's an aspiration that Biden has also achieved. In 21 and 22, our U.S. energy production outpaced U.S. energy consumption by an average of 1.5%, as opposed to Trump's first 2 years, when energy consumption outstripped domestic production by almost 9%. We're exporting energy now, not importing energy now. So, I think that one of the things that the DeSantis program demonstrates is that having a bachelor's degree from Yale and a law degree from Harvard doesn't mean you understand the economy, at least not if you're the governor of Florida.
Yeah, I mean, when I read your article, it seemed to me this is the DeSantis' so-called economic plan is symptomatic of his campaign. Everything about it, starting with the, I was going to say liftoff on Twitter, but it didn't lift off very well, is sloppy. You would think even if governor didn't know much about economics, that he'd hire someone who did to write his campaign document on the economy. And it just seems, it just seemed like a pretty sorry effort, like the rest of his campaign. He started out in the polls when he got into the race in the low 30s against Trump. Now he's down to like 19 or 18% in the national polls, and it's definitely going in the wrong direction. It just seemed to me his work, his plan was very sloppy, and you did a very good job exposing it. And I also think that if anybody wants to read Dr. Shapiro's article on the DeSantis plan, they should go to the Sonecon website, which is sonecon.com, and read Rob's article for yourself. One last thing I'd like to ask you about, the new initiative by the Biden administration falls under the rubric Bidenomics, which is obviously a play on the old Reaganomics term. And when I first...
And on Clintonomics.
Yeah, right, exactly. It is... When I first saw the term Bidenomics, I said, oh boy, that reminded me of Reaganomics, which was an ugly disaster, you pointed out. Why call it Bidenomics? Is that a good idea? Does that reflect what's going on? Or is that harken back to a very bad memory?
No, I think it's actually earned that the pace of growth, the enormous job creation, we also have, investment has been growing 50% faster than under Trump in his first 2 years. This is a result of the American Rescue Plan, which has helped drive growth and employment, and the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act has stimulated enormous investment in alternative energies, which is one of the reasons that We're now an energy exporter instead of an importer. The CHIPS Act has led to really a boom in investment in new factories. This is a success story that he can claim a lot of credit for. Now, always, the economy is a huge machine, and the reason that he could have these positive effects is that the fundamentals of the US economy are strong. They've been strong for 80 years, and they're still strong. And, that's one of the reasons, that's the material reason it's such a blessing to be an American.
Tomorrow, as I said, is the first anniversary of the signing of the Inflation Reduction Act. How do you plan on celebrating?
Well, I'll raise a glass to the White House.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, one thing I want to ask you, one of the pernicious effects of Reaganomics was it generated income at the top of the income level, but was rather devastating to middle-class working families. Could you talk, one thing you mentioned earlier in the segment is that this recovery has helped people at the bottom of the economic ladder. Could you talk about that a little bit, please?
Absolutely. The last time that we saw wages and incomes of the bottom half of Americans increase faster than wages and incomes for the top half, or even the top 20%, was the Clinton years. And we saw a deep reversal of that under Bush. I think Obama made it a little better, but the fact is, he was dealing with trying to clean up the collapse of the economy under Bush in 2008. It didn't happen under Trump, and it is happening now. And one of the reasons, I'll tell you the reason is that if you can sustain growth at around 4% or less, at 3% or greater, if you can sustain that, you pull into the labor market people at the bottom. And in addition, labor is in a new era in which they have been able to effectively challenge a lot of our biggest corporations. And the result is that, if you want workers, you're going to have to pay them more, and in a strong economy.
I think we should all raise a glass tomorrow to celebrate the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Rob, thanks very much for joining us again. Our guest in this half hour was the noted economist, Dr. Robert Shapiro. I want to thank all our guests, including Rob and Bob Deans, Director of Strategic Engagement for the Natural Resources Defense Council, and our Crackerjack executive producer, Mark Grimaldi. We'll be back soon if the Lord is willing.